Today we are reflecting on some verses from John chapter 17, very well known chapter in the New Testament, and in John's Gospel from chapter 14 to 17 is sometimes known as the farewell discourse. The words given by Jesus to 11 of his disciples at the end of the Last Supper, after Judas Iscariot has left the night before the crucifixion. This prayer in John 17 is intensely tender and intensely profound, sometimes known as the farewell prayer or the high priestly prayer. We're looking at verses 6 to 19 today, but I'm just going to say a few things about what is said before verse 6, because I think it's really important. Jesus names and honors his very particular oneness with his heavenly Father and his utter dependence on him. He also refers to something that some people find very elusive, and it's this concept of the pre-existent Christ. And Jesus speaks of the glory that he had with God before the beginning of the world, sometimes referred to as the cosmic Christ, who has been and always will be one with all that is. And Jesus and the Christ came together in the person of Jesus. It's a whole other thing. It's a kind of foundational mirroring out of which Jesus lived and breathed. And I think it's really important to remember that that's where he lived out of and who he lived out of. And in this prayer, he seems to be yearning for us to waken up and realize that we too are to share in this mirroring. And in a paradoxical way, we already do share in it. But this deserves a great deal of particular reflection, and I'm not going to do that today. It's obvious that Jesus in this prayer is aware that his earthly life is coming to an end, and he's beginning to let go in the sense of trusting God to take care of his disciples for him when he is no longer physically present with them. He describes them as having been given to him out of the world, and he sees them as gift. It's very beautiful. I always think it seemed incredibly random the way he encountered the disciples at the outset of his ministry, when he would seemingly quite spontaneously invite them to follow him, not knowing them. Or did he? It doesn't smack of a careful, discerning, elaborate recruiting plan. I mean, if you know that you have the sealed orders to reveal God to the world, and that you are the embodiment of the incarnation, which in itself is hugely countercultural, you think you'd want to make sure you have exactly the right people around you. And often the disciples seemed to disappoint and just not get it. But here in this prayer, it's so tender. Jesus sees them as a gift. In verses 13 to 17, there's an interesting thing going on. He starts to name the inevitable conflict which will come their way as they declare a new vision of God's pattern for our lives. Jesus' path will often lead us into some messy stuff and turns many things upside down, and we don't like it when suffering and failure are part of the deal. Jesus is asking God to protect the disciples, but he's not saying anything about an exit plan when things get tough. He's not sugarcoating anything. He never skirts around suffering and pain. Rather, he goes straight to the place of pain, and he fully intends to accompany us to that place as well, walking every step of the way with us. If it feels like we're called to a path of suffering with our fellow beings, then we can be sure that we're accompanied by Jesus, who himself surrendered completely to the worst that humanity would throw at him. And he fell all the way through that pain and emerged out the other side, transfigured. That's our pattern also, whether we like it or not. Jesus also asks God that we be sanctified, kind of set apart, consecrated. But sanctified is quite different from sanitized. There's nothing sanitized about Jesus. In the Christian Aid material this year, we're invited to stand alongside people whose lives are much more on the knife edge than ours. There's a profile of a woman called Rose who is from Kitui in the eastern province of Kenya. Her community is caught in a cycle of climate chaos, severe drought and severe flooding. And this leaves them with no reliable source of water. And against her photograph is this question: will you stand with her? Will you stand with her? This question was filtering around in my mind for a couple of days towards the end of last week, when I received a phone call from my daughter Aelred to tell me about something astounding which was happening at the end of her street. I hope that by now most of us will have seen footage of or heard news of the astonishing protests which took place on Kenmure Street in Pollokshields. It was for me a living embodiment of standing alongside those who are persecuted. On Thursday in Pollokshields, over 200 neighbours and protesters surrounded a Home Office immigration enforcement vehicle. Inside this vehicle were two local residents, two Indian Sikh men who had been forcibly removed from their home in what was described as a dawn raid, but it wasn't dawn, and I'll come back to that later. They actually live across the landing from a woman I know, and she's been there for 40 years. There was some disturbance. People who have been to dawn raids will know that Home Office officials are not known for their lightness of touch or discretion. And without hesitation, neighbours surrounded the vehicle, and word spread very quickly, and it escalated until the street was jammed with angry, outraged and compassionate protesters. The Sikh men were confined and contained in that windowless van for most of the day while the standoff continued. In Glasgow right now, the Home Office have stated their intention to significantly increase their efforts to forcibly remove individuals whom they consider to be illegal. If you want to know more about the hideous, despicable and widely condemned practice of dawn raids, David would be happy to tell you more. He used to take part in protests in Glasgow a few years ago, usually about 5 a.m, trying to prevent officers from the Home Office removing families and young children from their beds and take them into custody. It's happening again in our city. This attempt on Thursday was made on a major festival day for the Islamic community, the glorious day of Eid, which comes at the end of the month of Ramadan. It's a joyous day in Pollokshields, and it's shared by many people in the community, whether they are Islamic or not. Pollokshields is probably the most multicultural part of Glasgow. I lived most of my adult life there and brought my children up there. It also happens to be within the constituency of Nicola Sturgeon, our First Minister. This kind of solidarity is entirely what I would have expected from the Pollokshields community. One of the protesters crawled under the Home Office van and lay there for the duration of the protest, and I'll say more of him later. The recurring chant from the crowd was, "They are our neighbours, let them go." They are our neighbours, let them go. Whilst this drama was unfolding, another historic event was happening at the Scottish Parliament. New MSPs were being sworn in at Holyrood, and it was the most diverse group in history for Scotland. They took their oaths in British Sign Language, Orcadian, Welsh, Scots, Gaelic, Doric, Arabic, Urdu, and Punjabi. And this was after an election in which refugees for the first time had voting rights in Scotland. And our own friend Justina, who we know, voted for the first time. So the Home Office sent in an identifiable vehicle with immigration reinforcement written on it, in the daylight, into the most multicultural community in Glasgow, on a significant festival day for the Islamic community of Eid, into Nicola Sturgeon's constituency, and on a day when MSPs are being sworn in at Holyrood. It's quite a statement. The outcome on Thursday in Pollokshields was that the detained men were released into the safe custody of Amar Anwar, a well-known Glasgow human rights lawyer. 3 images from that day have been absolutely burned into my mind and my heart. And sometimes I've wondered if my imagination is unhinged. But let me tell you what has come to me. The first image is that moment when the heavy doors at the back of the Home Office vehicle were flung wide open, and the detained men emerged from that darkened van into the daylight and were met with a spontaneous outpouring of cheers and joy and triumph. They had been contained, powerless, and probably fearing that their lives were hovering between freedom and deportation. They would have heard those chanting protesters all around them. When I saw them emerge into the daylight, I remembered the words of Jesus when he commanded Lazarus, who had died, to come out of the tomb. Lazarus emerged into the daylight and was untethered from the wrappings of death. Can you imagine how those guys must have felt on Thursday? In a single moment, they moved from darkness and desolation and were engulfed by the warm, beating heart of a Glasgow community, fiercely on their side and refusing to abandon them. Can you picture a better image of paradise? The second image is the procession of the crowd as they accompanied the two men along Nithsdale Road to the Pollokshields Mosque, a place of sanctuary and warm food. It's not difficult for me to see that they were in the company of angels. But the third and strongest image is that of the protester lying under the Home Office fan. There's an amazing photograph of him. The detained men in that vehicle above him would not have known that he was there, laid out on the ground for them. Let's think of that. Laid out on the ground for them. I've looked at this photograph a lot in the last few days, and I just can't stop the image of a cosmic Christ after the crucifixion going to the underbelly of darkness and vulnerability. And who knows what kind of redemption he took in his wake for all who need set free from their chains. That man on the ground in Kenmure Street lay under the belly of a vehicle which for me symbolises a system of domination and abuse of power. That crowd was made up of people from many nations and backgrounds. And on Thursday, their paths became one path. The kenotic, self-emptying path of love, which refuses to abandon the neighbour. Whether they were aware of it or not, I felt sure that paradise was within them, and we were surely in the company of angels and upheld by a grace that will never abandon us. Thanks be to God.